Seemingly out of nowhere, the Islamic militant group ISIS sprung out of the desert, sprung up out of the chaos of Syria and set up a sort of quasi-state in the Middle East. In fact, they're calling themselves now the Islamic State. It has a sophisticated social media presence, and as you can see here, the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is calling himself the Caliph. So it seems to be becoming official, at least in ISIS's own estimation. I think they're also, in fact, issuing passports now, which we can show you an image of. They're issuing passports within their territory. That is an ISIS or Islamic State passport. As well, they have taken up a huge chunk of land, largely between the Euphrates and the Tigris River in Syria and Iraq. Let me go to a map and show you this exactly the number of towns and area they've taken up. Coming out of Syria, basically ISIS is taking control of almost every town along the Euphrates River, leading all the way to Baghdad. They're also working down the Tigris. Mosul, obviously the biggest city they've taken control of, into Crete. They're working on taking control of Saddam Hussein's old hometown. This is an important one. Baiji. Buck, is that right?
Baiji?
Baiji.
Baiji's where the biggest oil refinery in the country is. So
that's exactly what I was going to say.
There we go. Sorry.
But no, that's a big town for ISIS because they can eventually self-fund through any oil they confiscate in that area, which, Buck, I think is fascinating. I was reading, they're actually selling back that oil to the Syrian government. That's actually who the purchaser of any potential oil they're accommodating.
The insurgents stretching back to the U.S. Counterinsurgency period have found ways to try to do exactly that. They get their hands on oil, they'll sell it on the black market to whomever they can, including the Syrian government. They'll sell it to anybody. They'll also do cigarette smuggling. Anything to raise funds is what they'll do. And by the way, they're going to move more towards kidnapping and such as well. That always ends up happening when they run out of oil.
10,000 troops. That's reportedly what ISIS has in the region. 3,000 in Iraq and 7,000 in Syria. But, as I said, this seemingly came out of nowhere, but it didn't come out of nowhere. In fact, John McCain this week on the weekly Sunday shows suggested this has been a long time coming. Listen.
We did have this situation stabilized thanks to the surge, that we could have left a residual force behind which would have stabilized the situation. This is not like a hurricane or an earthquake. This didn't have to happen. This is a failure of United States policy.
In fact, Eli Lake in the Daily Beast said the following. He wrote an article that said, on November 1st, 2013, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki visited the White House and made a rather stunning request. He asked President Obama, and this is, of course, Maliki, who was celebrated when U.S. troops left Iraq in 2011, asked him quietly to send the military back into Iraq and to help his beleaguered Air Force develop targets for airstrikes, knowing that the Sunni insurgent groups led by ISIS had become a real threat. President Obama did not act upon that request. In fact, he said the following after that meeting. Listen.
And much of our discussion centered on the fact that although Iraq's made significant progress in areas like oil production and a range of other reforms that have taken place, unfortunately Al-Qaeda has still been active and has grown more active recently. So we had a lot of discussion about how we can work together to push back against that terrorist organization.
Al-Qaeda. No mention of ISIS. And in fact, what we're talking about now is the ability of ISIS to set up this quasi-state, to have a war basically on two fronts, things that Al-Qaeda was never capable of accomplishing. Now, joining us now is David Gartenstein-Ross, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a professor in Georgetown University's Security Studies program. David is also the author of Bin Laden's Legacy, Why We're Still Losing the War on Terror. David, how is it that ISIS has been able to accomplish so much in such a short amount of time, seemingly where Al-Qaeda could not?
Well, first of all, let me say that the president wasn't wrong when he said that at the meeting with Maliki he talked about Al-Qaeda. At that time, ISIS was a part of Al-Qaeda's network. It's the successor organization of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and was a part of Al-Qaeda until the beginning of February of this year when it was officially expelled from the organization due to its insubordination. As to how it became so strong, there's a complex number of things that have worked together in its advantage, one of which is the fact that the Syrian regime, Assad's regime, has preferred to focus its military resources on more moderate factions in order to have both the Islamist parties, or rather the jihadist parties there, ISIS and Nusra, as well as the Kurdish parties, who are not immoderate but are feared by neighboring states, comprise a bulk of the rebellion against him, basically to show outside states that supporting these organizations will incur a price. As to what happened in Iraq, as we all know, the Iraqi military melted away in the face of ISIS's advance. It's certainly a very strong organization, but it also hasn't really been tested yet, and also it's depending upon a coalition. I mean, if you look at the ground that it controls, the estimate that you gave is that there are about 10,000 fighters. The estimates are all really just approximations or guesswork, but 10,000 is reasonable, and 10,000 guys can't hold all of that territory. They really need to depend on other Sunnis working with them, and they already seem to be, to some extent, really starting to make them worried about allying with ISIS.
There's definitely a feeling, David, it's Buck, a feeling of deja vu for those of us who worked counterinsurgency 1.0 in the days when we had U.S. troops on the ground there. AQI, of course, had a schism with Al-Qaeda Central. We remember that Zawahiri wrote that long letter about how what AQI was doing was such a bad idea. How seriously do you take? Right now there's this consolidation happening where ISIS, or the Islamic State, whatever we are going to call it, is trying to get other groups to come under its umbrella. But how seriously do you take the schism between ISIS and Al-Qaeda? It seems to me almost like this is now a public relations gambit. They say, oh, well, whatever they're doing, we're not necessarily responsible for. We've been here before. The same thing happened with AQI, and there was a lot of operational cooperation between those groups, even though technically they had stepped outside the fold.
It's a very real schism, but you make some very good points. It's a real schism, and the reasons that we know this are, number one, ISIS did get expelled from Al-Qaeda. Number two, if you look on the ground what's happening in Syria, ISIS has been fighting in Syria against Al-Qaeda's acknowledged affiliate, the Nusra Front. There has been blood spilled. There have been people killed. ISIS has seemingly assassinated representatives of Al-Qaeda who were there in Syria. And number three, ISIS is really bidding to get members of the Al-Qaeda network to defect and join it. They've been unsuccessful so far, but there's definitely competition between them. That being said, I think that your reference to the letter from Zawahiri reprimanding Zarqawi is a very good one. The reason why is a lot of the question as to which group is going to be more powerful in the future gets to that basic strategic difference. On the one hand, ISIS is much more brutal than Al-Qaeda is. Al-Qaeda wants more of a
just real quick, David, what I wanted to get at with that is just that if ISIS comes out on top of all this, if they become the umbrella jihadist group in the region, I have a feeling that Al-Qaeda will mend fences with them.
Well, maybe. It depends on what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, right now, Al-Qaeda has branches in, in Somalia, in North Africa, and the Caucasus Emirate, which is operating in the Chechnya, Dagestan region, has also come out and said that they're in Al-Qaeda's camp. Ultimately, I think that Al-Qaeda is positioning itself to mend fences. If you look at all of their statements, all their statements call for both reconciliation and also adjudication in these various disputes. So it's a real schism, but it's also not an irreparable schism, particularly if Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, is killed. You might end up getting a leader who's more amenable to mending fences with al-Qaeda.
What I'm curious about, and I guess this could be answered by anybody here or by David, is how well ISIS is winning the hearts and minds of these people in the region. I mean, that's the real question. David mentioned that they haven't been tested yet militarily so much, but how many people are being pulled along by what ISIS is doing, marching through?
That, I feel like, is an important question that has to be answered next. And I read an article in Time, I believe it was Time magazine, where it was from a former CIA operative, and he was talking about the ISIS's use of social media to put out a lot of their propaganda videos, of beheading videos. They tweeted one out with the hashtag World Cup that got a lot of press, and they argued that this was a former CIA guy, so I'm going to lean on you
never trust
to
them,
rebut it,
just so you understand.
or say it's true. But he basically said that a lot of people around there, a lot of people in the community are going to see ISIS brutality and they're going to overreach. That they say that they're doing too much now, to where they're being too bloodthirsty, that it could have the opposite reaction. And that to me, it sounds like maybe in some other parts of the world that maybe that would happen, but I'm not so sure if I see that working
There's a
out.
combination of coercion and co-option that goes on. This is true of any insurgency. They're going to try to look for people that will work with them or turn a blind eye at least to their activities, and they're going to look at people and say, well, you better go along with this, or you at least better stay out of our way, or we are going to saw your head off in the public square. This is exactly what AQI did a few years ago when they were fighting against us there in the counterinsurgency.
But you're seeing, though, their bark has maybe been a little bit worse than their bite lately, because as they've taken over territories, they've said
that a lot more than what they've actually done. They actually haven't been beheading people in the public square.
Well, they did say they executed 1,700 Shia.
Right.
Which might turn out to only be 120 guys. Still a lot.
But still they're executing people that are hands-tied, yeah.
They said they had the general of the Iraqi army and that they were going to execute him in the public square. They didn't actually do that. They said they were going to start enforcing some tenets of Sharia law, which they actually have not been enforcing yet. And so I think maybe they are finding that it's a tougher challenge to actually get people behind.
Let me go to you last, David. We only have about 30 seconds left, but you mentioned they haven't been tested yet. How would you suggest that ISIS be tested?
Well, you're going to see both the Iraqi offensive, which already has been tested them to some degree, but Iran is helping them, and also Syria is finally actually starting to be serious about them, in part because of their massive advances. Syria's basically using this opportunity to show its value to its neighbors.
All right, David, thanks for joining us tonight. Misfit Stories are coming up next.